right. Welcome everyone back to the Yogic Studies podcast. This is episode 46. I'm your host, Seth Powell. And welcome back everyone. It's been a while actually since we've recorded an episode. It's been a busy summer filled with travel and conferences, and I've just returned from the first ever Yogic Studies summer camp here in Northern California, where it was so wonderful to get to meet so many students and members of the Yogic Studies community in person, where we gathered and studied and practiced and ate great food and built community. So as wonderful as all of this online technology and learning is, it really is incredible and was a great reminder of how special it is to get to gather in person. So hopefully more of that coming up. Today, speaking of online though, I'm excited to introduce and to welcome one of our newest instructors at Yogic Studies. Today we get to speak to Kunsang, who is a translator and teacher of Buddhist philosophy and Tibetan language, and she's going to be our new Tibetan teacher here at Yogic Studies. So welcome, Kunsang.
Thank you, Seth. It's great to be here.
Yes, it's really wonderful to have you here. We've been wanting to add more languages to Yogic Studies for a while, and we put out this language survey to our community to find out which languages students wanted to study in addition to Sanskrit, Hindi, and Pali, which we had already been offering. And actually, it really surprised me. I think I told you, it really surprised me which languages were most requested by our students. We had about 300 people fill out the survey. And actually, the top requests were for Latin and Greek at Yogic Studies. Go figure. I blame Antonia Rupel, our wonderful Sanskrit teacher and classicist, for that. But within the broader Indic and Asian language families, Tibetan was by far the most requested language. And that was no surprise to me. We have a strong Buddhist studies track and curriculum that we've been building at Yogic Studies. And of course, the history and traditions of Buddhism is very intertwined with the history and traditions of yoga. So I knew we wanted to add a classical Tibetan language program, and it was just a matter of finding the right person to step in and to be able to help us develop that. So I was really pleased to learn about you. I actually was recommended you from one of our other instructors, Aleix Ruiz Falquez, who's our wonderful Pali teacher. And I said, do you know anybody who teaches classical Tibetan that you think would be a good fit? And he said, my Tibetan teacher, I think would be a really good fit. She's a wonderful teacher and so knowledgeable. And I think she would fit really well. So, and that, to me, that was very high praise coming from Aleix, who himself is quite a brilliant scholar, linguist, and teacher of Pali. So congratulations, welcome. It's really, it's an honor to have you here. I'm so glad we were able to find each other through Aleix. And so first of all, just welcome to the Yogic Studies family.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Aleix, as well. He's a great scholar and a very good Tibetan student.
I'm sure he'll be pleased to hear that. So why don't we begin? Maybe just tell us, a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do currently, and then we can kind of start to peel back a little bit further from there.
All right. So I'm a Tibetan language teacher and translator, and I also teach a bit of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy from the point of view of debate. I mainly teach in the debate form. and I have a small group of Buddhist studies called Proyecto Despertar. Is specifically for Spanish speakers, so all of our activities are in Spanish. We have study groups, and also I teach Tibetan language for Spanish speakers, and I teach also English grammar to Tibetans or to Tibetan speakers like Ladakhi, Lamas. They need to learn English from zero, and they need someone to teach them a little bit also in Tibetan, the grammar. So I do all that, and also written translations.
Well, that sounds like a lot. And where are you based? Where are you teaching now? Are you teaching in person? Is it mostly online? Tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, I teach mostly online unless a specific course is organized by a Buddhist center and they invite me over there to teach this course. But otherwise, I teach online most of the times, and also all the translations are online, unless, again, there is, especially after COVID, everything, became online. So even the translations, I used to travel much more in the past before COVID, and now almost everything is online, all the translations.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
We were doing this before COVID, but then during the pandemic and lockdown, it just moved everything online, and it made it so much easier and sort of accepted and accessible, for people to do this kind of work. So you're
Yeah.
teaching, for example, you mentioned lamas in Ladakh. Is that online?
Yes, actually, lamas from Ladakh, but who are in the West,
Okay,
because that's why they need to learn English. Probably they got sent to a Buddhist center and they don't know the language, so they need to learn the language once they're in the West.
I see. I see. And where did you say you're based currently?
Physically, I'm based in the Canary Islands, so in an island in the middle of the Atlantic. Is Spain, but geographically it's next to Morocco.
Wow. So interesting. I know very little about that part of the world. Uh, what brought you there? Do you have connections to that?
Yeah, actually, yes. From my father's side, my family was Canarian, and they left the Canary Islands during Franco dictatorship. They migrated to Latin America. So I had never lived here before, but around 6 years ago, after lots of traveling, I just wanted to settle in a place with good weather and that is not too expensive, and where logistically I can still travel around Europe. So this was a perfect place, and I moved here. Went back to my Canarian roots from my father's side.
Oh, wow. So interesting. Oh. So tell us, so you didn't grow up there. You grew up, you said, in Latin America. Tell us a little bit about your background and upbringing, and then how did you get into this world of Buddhism and studying Tibetan and becoming a translator and teacher of the Dharma?
Yes, I guess when you put it like that, it's not like you ever planned for this to happen, right? It's strange to go back all those years and think how I ended up doing all this Dharma work. But I grew up between Venezuela and Italy. So when I was very little, I did like elementary school and a bit of secondary school also in Italy. Then I went back to Venezuela and did a few years there. I studied a bit of philosophy and literature at the university there as well. But the most important thing for me was that I met the Buddha Dharma because it had explanations of experiences. And from my mother's side, from my family side, as I was telling you, there's a lot of Native American roots as well. And I grew up in a very magical context. There was a lot of shamanism and rituals involved, and a lot of experiences that happen with the mind. So I was exposed to that since a very young age. And I had lots of experiences, but no explanation about it. no information. Why is this happening? Why you can have different mental states? What are the levels of consciousness? And what is reality? So through my philosophical research, I found Buddhism, and specifically Tibetan Buddhism. I started to get in touch with Buddhism through Tibetan Buddhist books. And that for me was a total revelation, because I realized that which I was looking for had already been explained thousands of years ago. And there was a very clear, very logical map, a very logical structure that you can study and understand reality and your own mind. So when I met Buddha Dharma, for me, everything else became secondary.
And
Everything else was, yes.
Around what age was that for you when you first encountered that literature?
That was 19 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, when I was 19. So I was just studying philosophy at university at that time. And it was incredible. Like everything else was secondary, as I was telling you. No matter which other book I read, whichever movie I saw, there was nothing compared to the understanding about reality and my own mind that I was getting from Buddhist philosophy. So I was completely fascinated, not only by the philosophy, but also by the magical aspect of it. Because I was telling you, I grew up with all these magic and stories and shamans and ceremonies in the forest. So I wanted actually to be a magician. I wanted to travel, in the sky and walk through walls and leave my footprints on the rocks. That's what I really wanted. I was so fascinated by the fact that you could achieve all these cities, all these powers, and at the same time be so rational. It's like the union of two things that normally they seem opposite, but Tibetan Buddhism had both.
Right.
So yeah, so I started.
So analytical, so precise, so much
Yes,
detail, so much um, analysis, as you said, of
yes,
all the categories and experiences and psychological makeup of the mind, and yet
yes,
also so fantastical.
exactly. Yes,
Yeah, people
yes,
try to. It's so interesting actually, because oftentimes in the West, the history of like the study of Buddhism in the West, a lot of the early Western scholars, Orientalists, wanted to sort of sanitize Buddhism and to say that it's just a philosophy, it's not a religion, and wanted to kind of ignore those more maybe fantastical or siddhi like elements, or the belief in different realms or deities or devas. Do you know what I'm saying? Sometimes Buddhism is sort of spoken of as this purely rational philosophy, and then wanting to extract it, but that's to extract the entire cultural and worldviews of the Buddha and his early followers, and the traditions that arose around it, right?
yeah, definitely. But the fascinating thing about Buddhism is that even those magical aspects, most of the time, have a rational base and they can be debated. And that's why at the end of the study program in the monastery, when you study the path and grounds of secret tantra, or mantra, obviously, the tantric studies at the end, you still debate them, because there's still a philosophical foundation for them. They're not random. So the entire structure of the five elements, the mandala, the dhyana buddhas, the yogas, all that is still very rational, very debatable. It's completely like in harmony with the paths and grounds of the bodhisattva that you studied until then through debate. So that's very special of Tibetan Buddhism, very unique, because there's a logic to it. There's a logic. Why that color is that deity? Why is that wisdom? Why is that affliction? And if you look for the origin, it's all philosophy and debate.
Yeah, well, I can see why you were drawn to Tibetan Buddhism in particular then, because it
Yes,
integrates so many of those elements. So, so,
absolutely.
so tell me more though. So you started reading and you became interested. in these topics, and you were studying at university some philosophy, and then
Yeah.
how did this continue to unfold?
Yes, well, for personal reasons, I ended up back in Italy and I joined a 2-year residential study program in Italy with the FPMT. So I did that living in Pomaya near Pisa for 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, with Geshe Champagyatso. And at the end of the basic study program, then I became a Buddhist nun.
Oh, wow. So through that program, you became ordained?
And not through the program, just everybody did what they wanted. But I wouldn't say it was through the program. I would say more it was through my teacher, really, Geshe Champagyatso. He
Okay.
was a total inspiration, a great yogi and an amazing scholar. So I just wanted to be like him.
Mm-hmm. And especially for our listeners, I mean, what does that process look like to become ordained as a Buddhist nun?
Yeah, it's very wonderful, very joyful. It's quite interesting because sometimes when people ask you about the experience of becoming a nun, they are concerned with very, very simple things like dressing or like, for example, not getting married. But when you become a nun, everything else is really so secondary. You don't think about all those things because what you're focused on is the most joyful experience in your entire life. Like you are doing what the Buddha did. You are leaving behind the kingdom, you're cutting your hair. You live with what you have on you. It's a feeling of joy that you can't express. The total true feeling of renunciation, of you live what you with the clothes that you have on, and that's it, and you have nothing and you go for enlightenment. So it's a wonderful feeling, especially at the beginning when you have all these aspirations of being a pure practitioner. So it's interesting because the things that people think are difficult, they're actually not difficult at all
Hmm.
when you become a nun. And the things that you think are easy sometimes are more difficult. For example, I remember at the monastery welcoming many new women that wanted to become nuns, and the worries that each one of them had were very different and very interesting. Like, for example, one of them was worried about showing her ears because she had never cut her hair. So, you have these things. Another one was worried about makeup because she thought she didn't look pretty and she will never be able to wear makeup again. So it's like there's so many different things, so many different experiences depending on each person. And for me, it was just a very happy moment, a very special moment. I was also the last person that my teacher ordained before he passed away. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. It was truly wonderful. It was a feeling that, okay, now I can really take advantage of my life. I will not waste any more time with activities that are not in the Dharma. So I was actually so happy. It was really wonderful at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay, so it was a 2-year program,
Mhm.
and you came out of it with a type of graduate degree and initiated, ordained as a nun, or is that not how you would describe it?
Yes, yes, I came out of it ordained as a nun. Now the degree, Buddhist studies are not so easy to classify. Is it a degree or not? It's called basic program and it's done independently. I don't know technically how much these studies are now recognized by Italian universities, so I cannot tell you if it's considered a degree or not. But I finished as much as I could because I was also working as a volunteer in order to cover the cost of my studies and my living expenses there. So at the end of the program, I really, really realized that it was very important to study in the original language. In that moment, for me, it was Tibetan Buddhism, so it was Tibetan language. And it influenced a lot the fact that I was in Italy and I was continuously listening to double translations. And that was truly horrible. Tibetan, English, English, Italian, Italian, Tibetan, English, English, Spanish. The meaning is so lost. And I knew a few languages already and say, maybe it's really a good contribution if I learn Tibetan, and then I could do Tibetan Spanish, Tibetan Italian, understand the Dharma better myself, understand better the meaning of what you're reciting, what you're praying, what you're meditating. So I said, yeah, why not? I'm gonna go and learn Tibetan in India. Yeah.
And was this then your first time going to India?
Yes, I went to India for the first time to stay. I had I had
One
never
one
even
way
visited.
one way ticket.
Yes, exactly. One-way ticket, a small suitcase because you gave up all your lay clothes, so you don't have much, and a few books,
Uh-huh.
and that's it. Yeah, I went to India like that. I
And
didn't know where
so,
to go.
yeah, where I was gonna say, where did you end up? I know in the south there are many Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and communities, but of course also in the north and Himachal Pradesh,
Yeah.
near Dharamsala and McLeod in those areas. So where did you end up?
Yes, yes. So at the beginning, because I don't know if you remember, I was talking with you some time ago about the fact that I wanted to be a magician and fly and everything. So I really wanted to do exclusively tantric retreat, Tibetan tantric retreat. That was what I really, really was wanted to do a lot when I went to India, and I read the books from Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo. So I went actually to her and I told her that I really wanted to join the study program in her monastery, and I wanted to do a long-term retreat, and I wanted to continue the lineage of the Togden Mass and all that. Really, I really wanted it. But when I arrived there, she was just starting. The temple wasn't even finished. The accommodations were not even finished. And she told me, actually, Kunsang, we teach in Tibetan because this is a Tibetan monastery. We teach for Himalayan nuns and for Tibetan nuns. So you have to learn the language. You cannot just come here not knowing Tibetan. And I was like, okay, that's no problem then. I go and learn Tibetan. I wanted to learn Tibetan anyway. That's why I went to India. And then there were several options. There was the Lotsawa Rinchen Sampo program from the FPMT. For me at that time, it was a little bit pricey, and also there were some technical issues that I didn't like, because you're supposed to train for 2 years after the program, but it has to be in their centers, so it's a little bit restricted. And then there was the Tibetan Library of Works and Archives. That's also very, very good. But there was not enough structure for me. There were people from different ages, from different levels in the same class. And it was not a monastic settlement, a monastic setting for me. And then there was Tosamling Nunnery, Tosamling Institute for International Women, and a really wonderful place, a small nunnery in the Himalayas, in the valley of Sirpur. Very nice, wonderful. And they were very kind. And thanks to them, they completely welcomed me, and I was able to join everything at a very affordable price. And then eventually it became free for all the nuns. When we got enough sponsors, then the education became free as well. So
And
that's how I could study.
was it mostly Tibetan nuns who were living there, or were there other foreigners there as well?
Yes, yes. In Chesamling Nunnery is a nunnery is still open. It's working now a lot as a retreat center lately. Also, there's lots of lay people studying there. It's an international nunnery, and we had nuns from all different lineages, not only of Tibetan Buddhism, but also we had the same nuns from Korea, from Japan. We had nuns from Singapore, from Malaysia. So really international. And the practices were in Tibetan, the studies were in Tibetan, but the practices were not sectarian, and there were people from all around the world.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like an amazing setting to live and study. And And it sounds so that's where you learn spoken Tibetan. Is that right?
That's why I learned both
Both. You
actually,
were studying
because
both.
yeah, both because they have a very good Tibetan language program. I think it's still running. When I joined, almost 20 years ago already. Yes, you had the first year was colloquial, and the second year was more focused on Dharma translation. Um, so yeah, it's not easy to separate both types of Tibetan actually. Some short time ago, I actually called a Tibetan language school from Dharamsala, Sarah School, to inquire about a student of mine that wants to join the philosophy studies there. And he already knows a bit of Tibetan because we've been studying for a couple of years. And they were asking me, how good is his Tibetan? And I'm like, well, he has studied classical Tibetan with me, but being alone in the West, it's not easy to learn spoken Tibetan. How can you practice? With whom do you talk? And the man got very angry with me. He was like, there's no such a thing as colloquial and classical Tibetan. It's all the same language. And it's a foreigner's invention, he said, actually. And like, I understand that he says that because it is the same language. But for us to be able to learn it is so different. Like there are so many different aspects in the grammar, in the words that you use, even the conjugations of the verbs is different, that it's okay to make this distinction as a foreigner between spoken and classical Tibetan.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So maybe we come back to that a little bit later, because we're going to be focusing, of course, on classical Tibetan, whether or not that's a a construction to chop it up in that category. We can talk about that more. You mentioned Tenzin Palmo and her nunnery, and I just wanted to mention that in one of my early travels to India, actually we got to go and meet Tenzin Palmo, my wife and I. Actually, we had a group with us as well that we brought to her nunnery. I feel like this was around 2011 or 12. Do you know when the nunnery opened? I feel like there was some construction going on.
It was already opened in 2007. It was already open, but it was a long process of construction, many years. She's still building, actually.
Oh
I
wow.
saw her now. Yeah,
But
last
it was
month.
it was such an inspiring visit. We got to meet many of the nuns and then have a private audience with her, which was incredible. She's such a amazing teacher and really embodiment of the Dharma. And yeah, that was definitely a very memorable experience. So you had originally gone there, and she said, "Learn Tibetan and come back." Did you come back to her nunnery after you learned Tibetan?
Yes, no, I didn't go back because when I went to learn Tibetan after the first year, then at the same time as the advanced Tibetan translation course was running, exactly at the same time, the first year of the traditional Tibetan philosophy studies
Mm.
started in the nunnery. So I joined that as well because it starts once every 5 years. So it was a very unique opportunity to attend the philosophy lessons, just like they do in a Tibetan monastery with the debate in Tibet and everything. So from the beginning, what little children learn at the beginning, that. So I started the first year. And then that year was very hard for me because I was studying simultaneously the second year of Tibetan studies and the first year of the philosophy studies with debate. So my Tibetan was not good enough,
And they
but
were teaching everything in the medium of Tibetan.
yes, exactly.
Must have been very challenging, but also you were absorbing it probably very quickly because you were so immersed in it.
Absolutely, yes. And I had lots of supports, like the older students that were very nice and they were always helping us. Geshe Tsewan. Geshe Tsewan Nyima was our philosophy teacher. He is from Drepung Löseling. He's a Geshe Larampa. He's an amazing scholar. He was very kind and very skillful. So he knew what we knew. He knew what we knew and how much he could push us. And it's amazing because truly everything I know comes from him and from his kindness, from his skillful way of teaching us logic and debate. So for the first year, there was a translation during the theory in the morning. Then, of course, there's no translation during debates in the afternoon. But after the first year, there was no translation anymore. So I joined that year. And then after that, that was the first year where we studied Dudra, is collected topics and foundations of debate. You learn with that book. And then, of course, the second year was logic, mind, and cognition. And it's an amazing text. How could I not stay one more year and study that? And then after that, there was static, which is also logic and debate. And then after that, there was philosophical schools. How could I live for philosophical schools if I went there for that? So I ended up staying for philosophical schools. And then what's next? What's next is parching the six perfections, like the entire Abhisamaya Lamkara commentary, like I could not leave. And I just stayed year after year because the topics were one more fascinating than the other. Every subject for me was like, I had the feeling of going deeper and deeper and that there was no end. I had really the feeling of, when Tibetans say to peel off the veils of ignorance, I felt that I was really, really doing that. I felt it in my mind. And I also felt that it was almost an endless process. Because when you thought you knew something, then you realized you didn't, and you didn't, and you didn't. And I kept going that year after year till we reached Madhyamika studies. How could I live? When we reached Madhyamika, I had to stay. That was the pinnacle, right, of everything. And then after all that, the very end of the studies, we had Tantra. So I actually went there for that, but
Right.
I ended up doing
That's actually
everything else.
that's really fascinating. Actually, can you say something about that? Why you need that foundation within this tradition of so many years of training and philosophy and ethics and logic and all of these different topics right before you get to Tantra?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's something that's not very clear at the beginning when we join or when we start practicing Tibetan Buddhism. Many people start practicing Tibetan Buddhism from what will be the end of the studies, which is Tantra and Tantric visualization and recitation. But when you start from the beginning, from actually all the philosophical schools, it's not like because you study Tibetan Buddhism, you don't study, like, for example, Sutrantika and Vaibhashika. You need them. You actually need Vaibhashika and Sutrantika to understand Tantra and Dzogchen. You need everything. Everything that is taught in the traditional study program complements each other. It's like one step after the other. Now you believe that the cup exists. Now you believe that it doesn't. Now you believe that it does, but it doesn't. Now you believe that everything else that you believe until now was not logical. And you keep going like that till you reach Madhyamika. And once you reach Madhyamika, then you really have the foundation for Tantra.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because if you don't have the foundation of Madhyamika to practice Tantra, then you end up in the extremes of existence or non-existence, which is what you're trying to avoid. So once you learn to avoid these extremes and you learn the foundation of the middle way, then you understand Tantra, because you understand that the only reason that anything can be anything is because it's not truly anything that you believed before. So if you don't have that very clear through Madhyamika and you just start practicing Tantra, then you will just end up grasping to a different appearance and believing that that appearance is true. And then if that happens, instead of Tantra becoming a way to come out of samsara, it becomes part of samsara.
Mm.
That's for Tibetan Buddhism.
Yes, fascinating. And so, yeah, carry on. This is really an inspiring and incredible story. So, what happened next?
What happened next is that when I reached the tantric studies, I was not that interested in it anymore because, of course, I completed them and I finished them and I did all the preliminaries. Every year you'll have 3 months silent retreat doing all the preliminary practices on all that. But
Every
I was
year,
supposed,
can I pause you for a second?
yes, yes, sure.
Every year you would do a 3 month silent retreat. Can you say something about that?
Yes, yes, because we do in the Tibetan tradition, we have the preliminary practices. So each preliminary practice, according to the tradition, should be done in retreat. Now, I know nowadays many centers they say, "Oh no, that's okay. You do it a little bit every day at home," but there's no comparison. Obviously, doing this practice in strict retreat for 3 months, 4 months, than doing a little bit every day and then going out and coming back.
Usually
It's
during the
never the
the
same.
rainy monsoon season, right?
That's right. That's right. Either the rainy season or the winter season, because I was in Himachal, so monsoon is a little bit different over there. We try to do either a pilgrimage during a break or a retreat with preliminaries during another break. We had 2 breaks through the year. So every year I was trying to complete these preliminaries, but at the same time, I also started translating for His Holiness Dalai Lama. So I was quite busy sometimes when there was a break. There were translations, some mostly in India. Once I traveled actually to the US as well for the Kala Chakra translation. So the last year after I finished Tantra, that year I was supposed to finish the short retreats and then do 1 year retreat and then do forever retreat. That was the original plan. But then that year I had to translate the Kala Chakra. So I had to skip the retreat and I went to translate Kala Chakra in Bulgaria. And then after that, I had to translate a tour from my philosophy teacher who
Do
went
you
to
mean
Latin America.
when you say translate Kala Chakra, do you mean
Yes.
the teacher is giving
The
live teaching
initiation. Yes, yes. The Kala Chakra
and you're
initiation. Yes.
translating it into Spanish or English?
Yes, that time was Spanish.
And all the audience, they have their headsets on, their radio transmitter,
Yes,
they're tuning
yeah.
into whatever language, right?
Yes, there was a translation in 18 languages at once, at one point in one Kala Chakra.
So you were translating for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You said
Yeah, many years.
how did that come about? That's worth talking about.
Well, it was just actually very simple because when you live there, you are there all the time. You are there all the teachings. So when there's a Spanish group, if there's no translation, then I just start translating for Spanish groups, and then His Holiness will always pass and say hello to the translator. So we just he just knew me as the Spanish translator. And then
Hmm.
because I was always there translating, then I ended up being like called to translate in certain big events like the Kalachakra initiations.
So you were living in McLeod Ganj at that time?
Yeah, I was living in Sidpur, but Sidpur is like half an hour from Ganj.
Okay. And
Yes.
what years would that have been? I wonder if I was there at a similar time.
I arrived in 2007.
Oh, okay. So that was, yeah,
Yeah.
probably a bit before my time. But but it's so lovely to hear you talk about it because it's been, over 10 years since I've been there. But we spent, I think, 3 summers in a row we spent in McLeod Ganj and in that area, and went to attended many teachings that the Dalai Lama gave at his main temple there, and even traveled to Ladakh and saw him give some teachings up in Ladakh. We had talked about that off air before. You just returned from Ladakh. You were telling me from a trip, but it's such a incredible culture and part of the world, and I hope I can go back again. Just imagining sipping chai, walking around those mountains, eating momos off the street. It's it's really conducive, isn't it, to your study and practice, to be in those kind of environments.
Definitely, yes, 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 definitely, because you, especially for the language, actually, more than the practice, it was good for the language because you can continuously practice Tibetan language. Now, I must tell you, for practice, Dharamsala Makluganj is not ideal. It's a
Mm,
bit too noisy, too busy.
sure.
So many of them, of the Tibetan monasteries for retreat, they're actually outside, away from Dharamsala. Dharamsala is more a center for study.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Did you ever consider doing a 3-year retreat?
Yeah, well, I considered it before I started studying. My short experience with 3 month, 4 month retreat between studies really taught me that you can achieve so much in retreat, but it has to be very long.
Has to
You
be
know,
very.
very long retreat. Yes, yes, because with 3 months, 4 months retreat, you get merely like a taste, of that nature of the mind. You get a taste of it, but I consider myself a very low practitioner, a very inferior being regarding evolution of my concentration. So as soon as the retreat is about to finish, I have completely lost sight of that taste that I got in retreat. So I realized that if you really want to remain on that pure level, you need many, 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 many years. Not even three. Three is not enough. You need three, and then again three, and then again three, and then again three. So because I studied a lot and learned the language, I wanted to work with that. So I don't see it now as something that I even want to do, actually.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So on that note, so you were doing this work as a translator, you were deepening your studies, your practice. At some point, it sounds like you started teaching Tibetan language as well. Um, Carry us forward now to today. You're no longer a nun, is that right? And now you're more of a lay teacher and practitioner. What if you don't mind, share a little bit about just that transition to, that decision to leaving that behind. In the beginning, as you said, it was easy, because your passion, your commitment, your faith was so strong. But things happen over time, right? And it's not always easy to maintain that same zeal and enthusiasm that we begin with, right? Or
Yeah,
no.
yeah, it's more than, yeah, definitely more than zeal and enthusiasm uh, towards the Dharma is still there. That has never changed. What changes is the circumstances or how you practice. For example, at the beginning, it was easier also because you feel like also a bit supported at the beginning. People tell you, so good luck, everything will be amazing, and of course, once in India, then year after year, you face many difficulties on every level, from a physical level, psychological level, cultural level. Anything really can become very difficult when you are alone in India and as a foreigner monastic in India. That was the main difficulty, actually, is that there is not much support for monastics in India if you're a foreigner. And most foreigners support Tibetan monastics, and all Tibetans support Tibetan monastics. So there was not enough support. It was very difficult even to get enough donations at the nunnery so that we could study for free. At the beginning, we had to pay. Tibetans never have to pay. We had to pay. And even if you go to a Tibetan nunnery, you will be asked to pay a fee. That's okay if you have the money, and that's okay if you can stay in India uninterruptedly. But as a foreigner, the main problem we have to stay long term in India is the visa. Very strict. You have to leave every 6 months or every year, depending on your passport, and that costs lots of money. lots of money. Like all the savings I had literally was spent on trips to renew my visa through those years. Almost 6 years I stayed in India. And finally, at the end, I got a long-term study visa, but that was just at the end of my stay in India. The last 2-3 years, I didn't have to leave. So you start losing all your savings, you use all your savings, and then when you are left with very little, you have to leave, because if you finish that bit of money, you will be stuck in a country with no papers and with no job and no money. So basically what happened is that my money finished, my studies finished as well. And also my interest in living surrounded by Tibetan culture also finished, because it is important to distinguish the difference between Tibetan culture and Buddha Dharma. Not all Tibetan culture is Buddha Dharma. There were, of course, very difficult situations because of being a female monastic, so being a nun. You are really disregarded by the monks, by Tibetan society in general. And then on top of that, you're a Westerner. So as a Westerner, you're very misunderstood. They think you're rich. They think you're there for a holiday. They don't understand why would you come to India? If you have your house, which I didn't have, and your money, which I also didn't have, in your country, which I also didn't have. So you know what I mean? You have no support from any side. And on top of being a nun, you're a foreigner. So it's very difficult. Tibetan society, sometimes they accept you, but not always. Once you learn the language, then everything changes a bit, because they appreciate that you try to, learn their culture and their language. But it's still difficult. You will never be the same, basically. And Westerners also, they don't fully support you, because you're like a strange thing. Like, let's make an example. If you have a really good Western scholar, an amazing Tibetologist with great education, and then you have a completely uneducated Tibetan Lama, and you put an ad at the Buddhist center, to whom you think most people will want to go to a Tibetan Lama, even though he's completely uneducated. Why? Because he's wearing some robes and they're exotic, and people are attracted to that. So this happens a lot to us Westerners in India. There is not enough sometimes recognition of your effort or your studies just because of being a Westerner. And then you go to a West and it's the same. It's the same, because you don't look like a nun. But when I looked like a nun, it was worse. So that's to reach like the explanation of why I had to quit also the monastic ordination. As I was saying, I finished my money, I finished my studies, so I had really technically nothing else to do in India other than lifelong retreat. and I was really tired. I was really exhausted of always fighting, for equality as a woman, as a nun, equality in the studies, equality in the recognition of your education, equality even in accommodation. Like even the simplest things were a great effort. But being a Buddhist nun in the West was also horrible, because many times I had to travel, or I did tours translating for lamas in the West. And it was actually really, really bad, because obviously you look weird. A woman with shaved head, with weird robes in the West, they tell you bad things in the street, they shout you names. I had even once a woman covering their children's eyes so that they wouldn't look at me, so they wouldn't be scared. So, so the robes create a very strong separation between yourself and others in the West. When the Buddha created the robes and shaven heads and all that, was so that you will disappear in the sea of Dharma. You will be like a drop. Everybody will be the same. There will be no sticking out, nothing that will feed your grasping to your identity. But in the West, this doesn't work most of the times, because it's the opposite. You stick out more. you have a stronger identity. People identify you more as something. It creates a barrier. It doesn't even let you talk freely with people when you look like that. So for all these reasons, then I thought it will be more useful to be just a normal, ordinary person, look completely ordinary, and then just work with languages and Dharma as a layperson. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's a very complex world today to navigate in that, in all of those different layers. Um, yeah, but I appreciate very much what you said, especially about how the robes can end up sort of feeding an identity or an ego and the separateness, when your initial purpose for taking that on is to dissolve that, and yet that can end up becoming a barrier. So that's really interesting, to think about further. But let's talk more now about the language of Tibetan, and we can use this to start talking about your courses. But tell us a little bit about your love for the study and translation work that you're doing in classical Tibetan. Um, Maybe you can tell us, one question actually to get us going. A lot of our students come from a background of having studied some Sanskrit. Uh, and I know you've studied some Sanskrit as well yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between Tibetan and Sanskrit?
Sure. Well, I'm no Sanskrit scholar at all. I know very little, actually, just enough to help me with Tibetan translation, because like you say, they are related. If you study Tibetan, you must have some notion of Sanskrit. But even if you don't, it will come, because Tibetan grammar comes from Sanskrit grammar. It's just a much, much simple version. And also the alphabet itself comes from the alphabet that, the script that was used for writing Sanskrit alphabet in the 7th century. So they are related, but we must not think that Tibetan comes from Sanskrit. Obviously, it was an independent language from many, many centuries. What Sanskrit gave to Tibetan was a structure. So Sambota, when he went to India to learn Sanskrit, to create the Tibetan script and organize it, the whole purpose of that was to learn the Dharma, so that Dharma could be studied in Tibet. And he was absolutely respectful and fascinated with all the Vedas, with the sutras also of Hinduism. And actually, in the text that he wrote, the first thing that he does when he pays homage is that he pays homage to Sadashiva, to Shiva, because of the Shiva Sutras, and the whole transmission of the vowels and consonants. So he was absolutely fascinated, and he took this structure but made it simple. Actually, after when he went back to Tibet from India, he spent decades perfectioning the Tibetan language as a system. And it was something that needed to be taught to people who already spoke the language. So it's very curious, because when you're teaching a language, normally you teach a language to somebody who doesn't know the language. But Tibetans, I always imagine being a Tibetan and somebody telling you, now you learn Tibetan, but I'm already not Tibetan. No, but now you learn it properly so you can study Buddha Dharma. And all the grammatical cases are the same as Sanskrit, but very simple. The tenses are way more simple than Sanskrit. If you know Sanskrit, this will be so easy for you. Really, really. If you know Sanskrit, you will learn much quicker also to memorize the words in Tibetan, because all the words in Tibetan were translated so accurately from Sanskrit. Like every syllable corresponds to a Sanskrit word. So if you know Sanskrit, much better for memorizing Tibetan words, but it's more simple. Only 30 letters, only 4 vowels, so much less than Sanskrit. And the wonderful thing for me for Tibetan languages that it was created to study Buddha Dharma. So even learning the language was considered a holy task, was literally something sacred to learn the language. Yeah.
So what type of texts and literature does studying classical Tibetan open up for a student? What kind of new worlds can they enter into?
The wonderful world of philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, and also depending which practice you do. If someone is like a Buddhist practitioner, then you can understand what you're reading, what you're reciting. You can understand better the visualizations that you have to do through meditation, and then on a mystical level, you can also understand the two realities. Really, you can understand everything through to the study of the language. Is so wonderful. Even the alphabet in Tibetan language represents the two realities, conventional and ultimate. And every aspect of the language is embedded with philosophy. So it's truly wonderful. For example, when I started learning Tibetan, I started a little bit already in Italy, because to join a Tibetan language course, you already have to know the alphabet and basic grammar. So that's why I was telling the students, maybe you should start learning the alphabet a little bit, because then it's easier to make some good progress. So when I was starting to learn some words, just by learning some Tibetan terms, I understood so much more about the philosophy. A very simple example, the word interdependence that we use all the time. Interdependence here, interdependence there. The Tibetan word for interdependence is Tenzin, and Tenzin has two syllables. The first syllable, which we translate as dependent, is ten. And the second one that we translate as inter is actually rel, that means connection, relationship. So interdependence in Tibetan, the first syllable, ten, it means rely on, something that is on something else. If this is not here, this other thing will fall. It needs a support. So that's the first word, support. And then the second word is connection. So what the word tendre in Tibetan actually means is that all phenomena depend on each other. They need each other. If one is not there, the other one can't exist. And they're also connected. So I don't know, just understanding the two terms separately, for me, was much better than just hearing the word interdependence. And it's like that with all the philosophical terms. Imagine that. Imagine that you learn a philosophy and a language, and then you study the original language, and you learn it all over again. Much better. Say, this is what it meant. This is what it meant by emptiness, by form, by impermanence. It's really fascinating.
Absolutely. And you see that so many of these terms have a range of meaning. And so when you see just a single English term, you sort of, and then once you realize the term in the root language, you realize that translator made a choice to render it into that English or Spanish or French word. And you can, once you see the range of possible meanings, it expands the possibilities completely.
Absolutely. But that's also a little bit dangerous, because Tibetan language sometimes is a little bit flexible, and sometimes there are too many possibilities. So the only way that
well,
how to say that balance this is by studying a lot of technical vocabulary from philosophy.
Correct.
You study a lot of philosophy, and then you know that from all that range, half of them are not
it can only mean
exactly.
this word in this particular context.
Exactly. And that's the right way to render that concept in that specific language. This would have been lost if you had to translate from a second language.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any particular texts that or translation projects that you've been working on, or any are there authors, or is there a particular genre or there's so much within the Tibetan Buddhist canon, right? It's a hugely expansive, um, wide-ranging corpus of texts. I've been to some of these libraries and seen, or these gompas, these monasteries, and they have walls filled with texts. So within that vast canon, is there something that you are focusing on?
Well, I really translate whatever comes to me, whichever request I get, as long as is Buddhist Tibetan philosophy. Like I've done maybe sometimes translations that have not to do with Dharma, but I don't really do those translations anymore. I focus on classical Tibetan and technical philosophy vocabulary. So I've had to translate all sorts of texts, like from termas, from very obscure prophecies, to just simple root texts into different Latin languages, and also commentaries of the root texts. The latest translations I finished was a translation of a commentary of the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas, for example, by a Bhutanese Lama called Jigme Tsultring Pelzang. So that's the latest translation work I've done. And then very often Buddhist centers ask you to translate sadhanas and practices and prayers and write the phonetics and all that.
I see. So people contact you and hire you to do the translation work for various individuals or Dharma groups or centers.
Exactly, yes. Exactly,
Okay.
yes.
So anybody listening who needs some classical Tibetan translated, where can they reach you for that work?
Yeah, well, I have an email and I have a website, but it's mostly in Spanish. It's called Proyecto Despertar Awakening Project. We have also a few videos about Buddhist philosophy in Spanish. But yeah, normally they find me through email or by recommendation from some Tibetan Lama.
Yeah, and we'll put links to all that in the show
Okay.
notes. So if people are interested in following up on that. But for people who are interested in studying and actually getting to learn Tibetan, this is your chance. We've got Tibet 101, the first course in a series of 3 terms beginning this fall, beginning, I believe, September 10th, 2024. So if you're watching this before then, enrollment is open and we'd love for you to join us. If you're watching this in the future, you might need to wait until the next round opens up. But this will be the first of 3 terms. We're so excited to launch this program and hopefully a program that we can continue to build on for years to come. That if we can get enough students to move through elementary Tibetan, that we could add even a second year and progress to more advanced levels to get everybody reading texts, translating on their own with the help of dictionaries and other sources. Kunsang, tell us a little bit about this course and a little bit about your pedagogy and your approach to teaching. How do you, what can students expect in that regard?
Well, I'm very happy to teach this course and I'm very excited because I've been preparing all these different terms in the way I wish I was taught Tibetan. So I was talking before with you saying that through all these years of learning in different ways from different sources and teaching different kinds of students with different levels, with different interests, I have accumulated a huge amount of material. But thanks to Seth, thanks to your invitation from Yogi Studies to teach this course, I had the chance to sit down and reorganize everything and really put it in a way that is just how I wish I learned. I wish I learned it like this, starting from, for example, obviously we're going to start with the alphabet, with phonetics, because you need to learn how to read and how to pronounce. I know most people really want just the classical aspect of Tibetan, the written aspect, but we must remember that Tibetan is very particular because it is an ancient language, but it is also a spoken language, like it's alive. So many people will be studying Tibetan language because they're interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and you want also to understand the teachings. You just don't want to only read the books. You want to be able to understand the words. So that's very important, and that's why the first part of the course we will be learning very well phonetic pronunciation, spelling. You will learn to spell just like Tibetans spell in school. And once all that is very, very clear, then we will enter the dimension of tones, because Tibetan language has tones. Now you might say, but why I have to learn tones if I just want to just learn the written language? And you have to learn tones. You have to learn it because there are many words in Tibetan that are very similar. Like, for example, you say che. Che could have like 10 meanings or more. But if you learn to differentiate the aspirations, you learn to differentiate che, che, che. So in a moment of doubt, you will be able to identify the word. If you don't learn the tones, that's fine too. But if you end up being an oral translator, or if you just want to listen to Dharma in Tibetan, you will have a bit of trouble because some words are very similar. And for us, learning the tones is not natural. We don't have that dimension. So we have to really absorb it and learn it. And then once you know how to read and write and pronounce perfectly, then we forget about it and we just start learning grammar, all the cases and
those
particles.
tones, are they expressed visually in writing, in orthography?
They're not, but the letters belong to a group of tones, so you just have to memorize them and then learn the different variations, because some prefixes and suffixes will change the tone of some root letters.
I see.
Yes. So yeah, I'm very happy because I really wish I learned like that very well. But I learned first spoken Tibetan with the basic grammatical structures, and then more classical with Dharma vocabulary. Our course is a bit the opposite because we start with classical Tibetan, and when you learn the basics, you will learn all the phonetics, pronunciation, reading, and spelling, and then we focus on grammar and articles, because the entire study of Tibetan language is based on particles. We use particles for everything, to conjugate, to create words, and to create the different grammatical cases.
Does Tibetan have a case ending system that is parallel to Sanskrit?
Yes, it has a case ending system. I am not a Sanskrit scholar, so I cannot tell you much more about it, but I can tell you it's much more simple. And I can also tell you that these particles do not change the form of the word. I believe in Sanskrit they do change, they become like a different word with a particle attached. But in Tibetan, no, they preserve their form, and then the particles kind of attach at the end of the word. Yes.
I see. And so maybe now is a good time. Can you say a little bit about how you view the differences between classical and modern or colloquial Tibetan? I mean, today, of course, Tibetan is spoken, and there's so many different regional differences and inflections, I'm sure, in terms of pronunciation, at least. Um, how do you see the difference between classical and spoken Tibetan, and how does maybe this course in studying classical maybe set up and give a good foundation for somebody who wanted to take on spoken Tibetan?
Yes. There are a few differences, right? The main difference is the conjugation of verbs. It's completely different in Tibetan and in classical. And in classical Tibetan, it's much more simple because you just have like affirmative, question, the endings for affirmative case question, then imperative. But for colloquial, you have persons, first person, second person, third person, past, present, and future. You don't have that in classical. We can say that in classical Tibetan, you can identify a tense by the root verb, but in colloquial, you need after that root a series of particles to create different conjugations depending on the person, plural, singular, and also the time. So on that aspect, they're different. You can read Tibetan very well, but if somebody speaks to you, you won't understand anything, because they will be conjugating using the colloquial conjugations. Then another big difference between classical and colloquial are the types of words that are used. There is a kind of a system in Tibetan that you have kake, you have the colloquial words, and then inside kake and inside the written language, you have shisa. Shisa is the honorific term. So what does it mean? That when you're speaking Tibetan and you need to refer to a person in an honorific way, you're going to use words that you don't normally use in colloquial, but you use all the time in classical Tibetan. You know what I mean? So you're going to have these words that you will only see them in pecha, in text, and then you will have some words that you will only hear them in spoken Tibetan. Why? Because they are neologisms, maybe, right? When Tibetans moved to India after the communist invasion of Tibet, they started using lots of new vocabulary. Some came from Hindi, some came from even English, some came from an interpretation of the sound of Hindi or English words. Some words didn't exist. They have to invent them using Tibetan words, but you will never find that word in a classical text. Like, for example, bicycle. Bicycle in Tibetan is kankor, is wheel of leg wheel. a wheel powered by legs, so to say. You will never find that word in a classical text. You will never find the word airplane. They had to make a term for airplane. What is airplane? Is the ship from the sky, Namdru. An airport will be the plain surface where the ships from the sky fall. That is what is airplane in Tibetan. You will never find those words in classical, but they might be used in a teaching. Because if you're learning Tibetan, because of Buddha Dharma, you may want to understand spoken teachings. So in which language do lamas speak? You may be wondering, right? In classical or in spoken Tibetan? Both. They speak in both languages. Why? Because when they're reading the text, they're reading classical. When they quote a verse, they do it in classical. When they give a very philosophical explanation, they do it 100% in form of debate, very classical. But if they have to say their opinion, their experience, something that happened yesterday, or a practical example, they will use colloquial words. And that's why we need to study the entire language as a whole. Now, in this course, you will have all the foundations for classical Tibetan. You will be able to read, you will be able to translate with the help of a dictionary, but we will also be checking a little bit how would the same be if it was colloquial. So you're not completely lost without any foundations regarding colloquial. For example, when we study question words, the question words in classical are very few, are very limited. There is one word, kang, that means when, where, what, everything, But in colloquial, no. In colloquial, the list is much longer because it's more specific. How is how, when is when, who is who. There is no more confusion regarding question words in colloquial. So, for example, if we study question words, of course I will give you also the colloquial ones. So you have them there, because it is possible that you end up also reading a more modern commentary written in Tibetan, and then obviously commentaries from the 20th century, they will have colloquial words and you need to know them. So I'm going to give you as much as possible whenever there's a chance. I will tell you, this is classical, but if you're learning Tibetan, you have this chart as well for the conjugation of verbs. Then you have a much better foundation. And who knows, maybe in the future, we can also learn to listen Tibetan, right? Spoken Tibetan.
Yes, we have a spoken Sanskrit series at Yogic
Oh,
Studies.
wow.
So why not have a spoken Tibetan in the future? Let us see. Well, that's wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, if you can see this, so we can look at the registration page for the course, yogicstudies.com/Tibet-101. You can see that the course runs live from September 10th through November 29th. It's a 12-week course. This first term, you then have a month off before the second term begins. I did want to highlight here in the course description, I think one of the unique things about your pedagogy and how you'll be teaching this course is using this traditional text on grammar, the 30 verses on Tibetan grammar. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited with this program, because we will be using the famous Sumchupa. The Sumchupa is the famous 30 verses on Tibetan grammar that was composed by the creator of Tibetan script, and Tommy Sambota. And it's a text that in 30 verses condenses all the main points of Tibetan grammar. So it's truly wonderful. I have never seen anything else in any other language like so condensed, so perfect, with all the grammar rules, how to write the prefaces and postfix. Everything is there. But that text is very difficult. It's really difficult. Even Tibetans, they can't follow it. They read it and, oh no, the Sunchupa, no, please. So luckily, in the 19th century, another Tibetan scholar had the great kindness of writing a simplified version of the Sumchupa, which is called the Magical Wish Fulfilling Tree, the essence of Tolmin's masterpiece. And that's a little bit easier to understand. So we're going to be using both of them because not all the verses are exactly the same. Like sometimes number 1 goes with number 1. Sometimes number 2 goes with number 2, but not always. The simplified version adds a couple of important rules that Tolmi Sambota didn't write in the Sun Chupa. And then on top of that, because the simplified version of the Sun Chupa is still quite difficult to understand, actually, I have found a very good commentary also, and I'm going to include some quotes from that commentary into our program because they're very good, very good. Like some verses that are explaining the simplified version of the Sunchupa are still difficult to understand. And this is like a commentary of the commentary, we could say. And then I will give you the commentary of the commentary of the commentary to be sure that everything is completely clear. So because this original text, the Sunchupa and the Wish Fulfilling Tree, they were created to explain how to write and read Tibetan to a person who already knows how to speak Tibetan. They're not 100% like suitable for us at the beginning to follow in the exact order. So we're going to be using them, but not following them exactly the same way they were written originally, because it's really difficult. So we're going to start, for example, with a verse that is not necessarily number 1. We may start with number 20 and then go back to number 2 and then go back to number 5. For example, one of the first things that we need to learn as non-Tibetan speakers are the nominal particles, how you create nouns, adjectives, how do you make them, how you create them. And that's not at all the first verse. That comes much later in the Sunchupa. Because for a person who already knows how to speak Tibetan, then you don't really need to tell them how to make nouns because they already make them spontaneously. But you do need to explain them how to create an affirmative particle. So that's why in the Sumchupa, they will start explaining you things that for us maybe it's better to learn later. Yes, so that's how we learn. We will use these texts, but the order will be slightly different, and it will be combined with a commentary, and then it will be combined with many more slides and charts and materials from myself.
I love it. That's fantastic. Yeah, so there's going to be so many materials, both sort of traditional pedagogy and then also, all of these supplemental charts and slides and so many things to help you along the way that Kunsang is going to be providing for us. So you'll have pre-recorded lectures that are released with every module. We meet twice a week on Zoom live on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 to 11:30 Pacific. Those, of course, will be recorded, though. So even if you can't make all of these sessions live, you can still join us. There's an online community forum where you can ask questions and interact with your fellow classmates and Kunsang. There'll be weekly quizzes as you go to test your knowledge. Yes, there will be a midterm and a final, but really they're meant to just reinforce all of the aspects of your learning, as you move through. But what would you say by the end of the first term going into the second term? What are sort of our learning goals, and where do you think students will sort of be at? And then likewise, by the end of the first year, do you kind of have a sense of what you'd like your students to be able to accomplish?
Yeah. By the end of the first year, you will have all the basic grammatical structures, all the cases and all the particles to be able to start translating by yourself with the help of a dictionary, basically. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Then, the rest, like if there's a second year, then we will go more in depth with verbs and verb conjugations and all sorts of different structures.
Yeah. And then, of course, an endless cup
Yes.
to continue to sip and explore, after that, of course. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, if you've made it through this episode and you're still listening, then you're in the right place. And we really do invite you to join Kunsang this fall for just a wonderful journey and opportunity to study this rich and ancient language that is still very much alive today, and that will allow you to enter into this incredible stream of wisdom and knowledge, whether you're a Buddhist practitioner wanting to deepen your own knowledge, or if you're just intellectually, culturally curious and wanting to explore another ancient language. We all are welcome, and no background experience is required or assumed in this course, right? We're really going to be starting at ground zero.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Kunsang, for sharing your story and letting us get to know you a little bit better here today, and for sharing your passion and expertise here at Yogic Studies.
Thank you so much for having me, Seth. Really looking forward to the course.
Yes, likewise. So we'll be in touch, of course, Kunsang, and to everyone else, thank you so much for listening, for watching. Please feel free to like and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, you can leave us a comment below, and we'd be happy to interact. If you have any questions or follow up about anything that arose here in this wonderful conversation here today. But other than that, thank you so much again to Kunsang and to all of our listeners, and hope to see you in class for Classical Tibetan this fall.